Welcome to Season 7 of my podcast, Between Us, Stories of Unconscious Bias. This season, I speak to people in Mexico, America, Ireland, Sri Lanka, India, and the UK. I have stories that I'm sure will resonate with anyone, anywhere in the world. For example, how to be more confident. Or how are we seen differently in the country of our birth, only because we don't look like everyone else? I also hear stories that are chilling, and I'm moved at how the speaker found the inner resilience to overcome their challenges. I hear stories of music, religion, and so much more. I hope you take away as much as I have when hearing these stories. Thank you so much for listening. I'd like to introduce Ashok Ferrey. Ashok is a writer. Well, actually, he's more than a writer. But his latest book, The Unmarriageable Man, won the 2021 Gratiaen Prize, Sri Lanka's premier literary prize that Michael Ondaatje started in 1992 with the money he received from the Booker Prize. In a parallel world, and this is what makes this conversation interesting, Ashok is also a builder whose last building, Cricket Club Cafe, was nominated for a Geoffrey Bawa Award. But hang on, that's not enough. He does something entirely different again. By day, Ashok is a personal trainer. And you're probably asking yourself, a novelist? Yes, tick that. An award-winning one. A builder? Yes, tick that. An award-winning one. And a personal trainer. That is an unusual combination. So I'm sure Ashok is going to have a lot of stories to share with us, and I'm looking forward to hearing them. Ashok, thank you so very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Smita. Thank you for having me on your show.
So as you know, our show, is called Stories of Unconscious Bias. So, your understanding of unconscious bias, what does that mean to you?
It's a very interesting one, actually, Anita. I think that, first of all, it's not really unconscious. You know it's in there, buried in your soul, in your brain, whatever you like to call it. I think these are sort of boundaries that we set ourselves. But we're very comfortable within these boundaries, even if we can recognize rather embarrassedly, rather shamefacedly, that they are perhaps not what other people think of as being fair. But we put ourselves in these things. Does that kind of make sense to you?
It does, but I'm just wondering whether the idea of unconscious, that you're saying it's actually not unconscious and you're aware of it, that's interesting.
I think you're unconscious of it to begin with. And then over time, because if it only happens just the once, it's not really a bias. A bias, by definition, is something that is ingrained in you, I feel, anyway. So I think after about the second or third time, you realize, oh gosh, this is a real bias I have to deal with. But at the same time, I think you're quietly a bit happy about having this bias. I don't know, I'm thinking aloud here. I sort of feel that it's something that we don't work terribly hard at getting rid of. And that's why it's there.
Okay, so what does that look like then for you?
Well, lots of different things. You have an instant or an ingrained dislike of something or to something, and you're quietly aware that it's there. So, for instance, to tell you a story, in the year 1980, I just come down from Oxford, and I didn't realize, but I saw the world through very privileged white eyes, although I'm not white. But you cannot help it, having lived in England and been to boarding school there, you see things through the very, very fixed lens. And then, completely randomly, I ended up working on a house in Brixton, which was at that stage considered the most dangerous place. And good heavens, why are you going there? Are you out of your tiny mind? You'll be mugged, you'll be robbed, you'll be everything else. Okay, so I go in there. And I find it's actually rather lovely. The life is great. I'd grown up in Africa. And the Afro-Caribbean influence in Brixton was fantastic. I loved the music, I loved the food, the curry goat and the patties and so on and so on and so on. And then I thought, gosh, this isn't at all what people painted this out to be. But I had that fear ingrained from this other stuff that's been put into me. And then you know what? I suddenly discovered that there were little old ladies crossing the road when they saw me coming down. So then the joke was on me. And I suddenly realized that actually I was the enemy. It wasn't me looking out for other dangers. I was the danger, apparently.
And why were you the danger, on a more serious note, from
Well,
their
well,
little old ladies? You're talking about white little old ladies who crossed
I
the...
think so, yes.
Okay.
The thing is that being Sri Lankan, I had this huge curly head of hair, kind of like the hair that my daughter Frankie has now. And to anyone, I looked Afro-Caribbean. There's no two ways about it. I may have thought of myself as Sri Lankan and a world apart from the Caribbean or Africa, but I looked Afro-Caribbean, which was marvelous. So it gave me this disguise. I was this enemy, a supposed enemy inside there. So the joke was really on me.
This is really interesting. I mean, I want to capture this again because we have to appreciate we're taking few things here for granted. So Ashok Ferrey, who has won this amazing literary prize, lives in Sri Lanka at the moment, in Colombo. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
So that is where you are. But you had a fairly privileged upbringing. You went to boarding school in the United Kingdom.
Yes.
Followed by university at Oxford University.
Yeah.
Followed by this great interest in building, and therefore went to Brixton in the early 80s, London. And for those of you who do not know London, what Ashok is saying is absolutely accurate, because this is what people were told purely as a very, sadly, very strong reaction following the influx of people who came from the Caribbean during the Windrush generation in the 50s and 60s. And a lot of them settled there. Because there were a lot of people in the United Kingdom who felt slightly threatened by this population coming to take jobs and working in the buses and so on, there was an enormous amount of racism. And because a large number of people who came from the Caribbean islands stayed and lived in Brixton, it was predominantly a black area. I just want to make these facts put out there because you might know it and I might know it, but a lot of my listeners may not know these facts at all. So now here you are in Brixton, which is a predominantly black area. You're Sri Lankan, but you're brown-skinned, obviously. And you happen to have a head of very, very curly hair. And you are dressed as a builder, I'm assuming.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So you got your overalls, which is why I couldn't help but laugh, because the joke was on you. So if we go back, and I'm sorry to kind of labor the point, so if we go back a few days before you arrive in Brixton, your thoughts, your ideas, and this is your phrase, and I'm playing it back at you, was the idea of white privileged eyes is how you saw the world.
Yes.
Because of the education you had. Now, that's a really important point that all of us listeners need to capture. Because you're not white, you don't aspire to be white, but because your entire education was around a white privileged environment, you only knew how to think like them.
Absolutely, yeah. And it came as a real shock to me to find that actually I was not any of those things. And it was actually possibly the greatest lesson I learned in my life was there, when everything was completely turned on its head. I was no longer this Oxford kid, cocky, coming down from Christchurch where, anything is possible, everything is possible, you are at the very top of the whatever. To find then you're absolutely at the very bottom of the rung, the very bottom. And it's a huge lesson learned to me. And I every day I thank my lucky stars that this random sequence of events meant that I ended up in Brixton building houses. Not even building, that's too grand a word. I was a builder's laborer to begin with. And throughout, I enjoyed laboring so much, mixing sand and cement, concrete, and so on. I enjoyed it so much that I continued even after I bought the building sites and I was working on them. I was a laborer. So I was literally at the bottom end of the food chain throughout those 8 years. Glorious years, actually, for me.
In fact, I must not give things away, and I urge you listeners to go and get The Unmarriageable Man, but I have read it, this award-winning book. And I'm visualizing that when, Ashok, when you're talking about your enjoyment of laboring, because certainly you talk about being in Brixton and working on the building sites and whatever you do with plaster and everything else. Sorry, my ignorance. But I could hear, I could feel the pleasure that you were getting out of it. So I get that. I get how your emotions in that, yeah.
You won't believe me, but there's quite a skill to laboring. The way you turn your wrist with a big shovelful of London soil or with a shovelful of concrete. It's all in the wrist, what you have to do. And it gives you those other skills. I hesitate to call them life skills, because they're probably not. But really, that is the finest kind of school of life that I encountered those 8 years.
And 8 years, and if you don't mind my asking, approximately how old were you there, those defining 8 years?
Well, I had just turned 23. So I came down from Oxford, did a year bumming around doing lots of really sort of strange jobs, and then drifted into work on building sites. I think what's happened was that it was easy to get a job on a building site. And sort of completely randomly, I ended up. And then I thought, being the idiot that I am, that I can do this. And then it's a question of trying to get a loan. And of course, everybody said no. And so on. It's all in the book, so I won't spoil it for you.
Please don't, because I loved the book. I kind of read it in sort of 2 sittings because I was rudely interrupted on sitting 1. I advise listeners to read it. Give yourself the afternoon off or 2 afternoons from whatever you're keeping busy and just read it. It's good. But to come back to you and unconscious bias stories, these ideas, the listeners are automatically saying, hang on a minute, did you just say Oxford graduate? Yeah. Did you say white, upper privileged, boarding school? Yeah. Did you also say a laborer mixing plaster? And so when we say these 3 sentences together, most listeners would say that makes no sense. Why has this Oxford graduate decided to be a laborer?
Well, that's a good question. And I'm not really sure even now, sort of 40, 50 years later, that I know the answer. The thing is this, I didn't have a visa. I was told I didn't have a visa to stay on. Right? As it happened, when I appealed against that decision, they decided, well, actually, they'd made a mistake, and I've been there since 1968, actually, a schoolboy. So actually, I was entitled to stay. But at that stage, I wasn't allowed to stay with inverted commas. So, of course, I did the only thing that was available to me, working illegally on a building site. So I drifted from one job to another to keep body and soul together. I had this maths degree, mathematics, and I was destined to become an actuary, which is one of those extremely well-paid jobs. But I had discovered, having worked in an insurance company, interning in one of the summer holidays from Oxford, I discovered it was a really boring job, very well-paid, very boring, and I knew I would have slit my wrists had I stayed on in a job like that. So that was the last thing on my mind, to work in a sort of financial institution or whatever. And added to that was the fact that I didn't have this visa. And so I just drifted. I drifted from one thing to another, ended up as a builder, as a laborer, builder's laborer on a building site, and found I loved it. That is the crazy part. I mean, I wouldn't have thought I would like it, but I did. So that's the answer to your question.
Well, no, and it's funny, isn't it? Serendipity, and how suddenly just something completely out of the blue, because most people, and this is what I understand certainly, and I'm taking away in terms of stories of unconscious bias, most people will stay with the path that you're on, follow the path that you're on. This is how it's going to be, and this is what it will be. And I can't help but thinking, how were your parents reacting to all this sitting in Sri Lanka?
My goodness, you can imagine proper South Asian parents. My father is an accountant, so you couldn't get anything more regular than that. They took me aside, they got their friends in. I was called in and given these stern reprimands and interviews and said, you need to go to Harvard Business School, you need to do this, you need to get an MBA. Even my best friend, whom I'd grown up with at school and university, wrote this long letter saying, don't throw your life away. I remember coming back to where I was staying, and I saw him 200 yards away at my front door. I didn't have the courage to go in because I knew he would have talked me out of it. And once he'd left, I crept back to the house, and there was this long handwritten thing. I wish I'd kept it, 2 sheets of it, written by him saying that this was absolutely wrong. I was about to sign the papers the next day and literally sell my soul the next morning. And he said, please don't do it, you're throwing your life away. And I'm so glad I didn't speak to him, because my life would have gone in an entirely different direction. And I would have been sitting in a job in the city, probably retired by now or whatever. And I wouldn't have had this whole other life that I have had. So it was very strange.
Which is building award-winning buildings and writing award-winning books, which is wonderful. But continue, Ashok, because your story in itself, just your introduction itself, has so many contradictions, you know what I mean, from a listener's perspective, that we don't understand who we're speaking to. You're a man who has many layers that have no connection to each other from most people's viewpoint. But clearly for you, they're all connected to each other enormously. As certainly the book could say, the one that I've read. I mean, I've read a few of your books, but I'm talking about the most recent one. But do share another story, Ashok.
Okay, now this one you're really going to laugh at. And we touched upon this briefly when we last spoke. I have an unconscious, well, now it's fully conscious, bias against things technical and things mechanical and things made up. Now, here again, it's very strange because I'm a mathematician first and foremost. I love mathematics. So you would have thought I would love the application of mathematics because almost all technology has at its base mathematics. So you look at computers, you look at phones. I think I showed you my phone the other day. It's the cheapest, nastiest Nokia on the market. It has the least number of, whatever you call it, least number of things you can do on it. It just rings and that's about it. Even to send a text is a very laborious business. But for me, that is as far as I want to go. That's the boundary I've set myself. I remember when I was on a building site, I was working on a house on Clapham Road near Stockwell Tube Station. And I remember going across the Sainsbury's at tea time, get a pint of milk. And there was a girl at the counter. She had purple hair. And I saw that she had a Sri Lankan name across, in those days, I don't know if this still do, but the workers at Sainsbury's had their name on their lapel. And she took my pint of milk, and I forget how much it cost, 50p or 52p or whatever it was. And I gave a £1 coin, and she couldn't subtract the 50p from the £1. She had to calculate it. And then it occurred to me that this was a very recent development, because up till a year or so before then, we didn't have calculators, or they had only recently come in. And so everybody was used to subtracting in their head. Now, with the advent of the calculator, arithmetic went out the window. And now if you ask any young person to subtract two numbers, they won't be able to do it. Multiplication, 12 times, they'd find it quite difficult. I'm not saying they wouldn't do it, but they find it quite difficult. And there's almost no need to, because you have a machine that does it for you. So what happens, a part of your brain atrophies. And this is why I have this bias against technology, because I think it's killing us with kindness. Does that sound strange to you?
No, not at all. I'm listening and I'm wondering whether I agree or disagree or shoot it down or what, because you make absolute sense. You make absolute sense. This idea of easy maths, my father, if he was still alive, would be in his mid-90s, and he would be shocked that someone without a calculator to do simple maths. Obviously you do it in your head. And even until recently in India, as you know, I'm currently in India while you're in Sri Lanka. And in India, even now, we can go into some shops. So I completely understand this and have the pleasure of seeing the shopkeeper doing mental maths and giving you your money back.
And giving you your change.
But the point is, I'm cognizant of it. I notice it because it is so rare. So I completely get what you're saying in terms of to make our life easier. But then I would also argue with you, that's a calculation. But surely in terms of connecting with the world, lovely WhatsApp, Skype, which is what you and I are recording on. All these things are wonderful, aren't they?
They are absolutely wonderful. And herein lies the rub. Once you get used to them, you absolutely cannot do without them. And then you wonder how you managed before. So they're absolutely beautiful, but what they also do is they take possession of you. They take possession of your soul. Even the very fact of writing a novel on a computer. I think I must be the last person on earth, well, maybe I'm not. I write with a pencil in an exercise book. Why? Because it seems to me more expendable. When you write on the computer, there's an air of finality about it. And I don't want that, because at that first draft stage, it's a slippery fish that can go in any direction.
Yes, those of us listeners who are writers in their own regard would be surprised.
It woos you and it seduces you with the ease with which it takes over your life. So when you think of my wife, for instance, who has a smartphone, and she's perpetually on the damn thing. Because she has WhatsApp groups, and she has this, she has news flashes coming in. And as you can imagine, in Sri Lanka, it's almost vital to have that news flash at the moment, because they declare curfew at the drop of a hat, and I'm the last person to know. But in a way, that's also my saving grace, because I'll probably wander out there not realizing there is curfew, and probably somebody will aim a rifle at me, because there are about 50 army outside my gate. But I'd probably get away with it, because they would look at me and think, oh, well, he's a dinosaur from a previous age, and of course he doesn't have a smartphone, and therefore he's forgiven. So the thing is that when you have these technological beauties, as I call them, you are expected to sit up and listen to them. So if you have a smartphone and you do not reply instantly, the other person knows it's willful negligence on your part, that you don't want to reply to it. Whereas I can get away with it and say, oh, I'm so sorry, this phone was switched off, as my phone is every day at lunchtime. I switch the phone if I have lunch, I have a siesta and get up and switch the phone back on. It's less of a ball and chain in my life than it is in the lives of most people where you have these fabulous things that you can, for instance, what we're talking on now is my daughter's laptop. I don't have a laptop, thank God. Although I can see that it's a hugely useful thing. It's not to say I diss it, but it's a boundary I've chosen to set myself, that I shall not go into all that. I think as far as I can manage without it, I will. And the day I have to cross the boundary, I will. My wife will laugh if she's in the room. She's not here. Because she'll say, well, of course, your entire life is dependent on me having the laptop, me having the smartphone. And that's absolutely true. But as long as, in a sneaky sort of way, as long as there's somebody else to do it, I will resist the temptation.
I think this is actually, it's a bigger subject than just your now conscious bias, not unconscious. I think you had your moment, your epiphany, watching the girl with the purple hair not able to do simple mental maths. And maybe that's then slowly gathered speed. And then, of course, fast forward 20 years, 30 years, life has changed more and more and more since 1980 something, let's call it 80,
yes, exactly,
to 2020. And it's huge, the change in terms of technology. But alongside this, and this is the bigger conversation, that you won't even know what that means, which I think is so remarkable, and that's called social media. Now, you have just won a prize, a literary prize. But the only reason we know that is because you have told me, or I've read it in the paper. Whereas most people, because they are on social media, would have put it on Twitter, would have put it on Instagram. And you would say, what does that even mean? You'll probably ask.
Yeah, exactly. I have put it on Facebook. So I am venturing rather gingerly into this world of social media. And that's only because my agent took me aside and scolded me. I said, for God's sake, get real, have a Facebook. But I understand from young people that that's also something of a dinosaur being on Facebook. It is no longer the mode of choice for your young, hip, whatever.
I've been told it's Instagram and not Facebook.
Well, I'm told it's Instagram. I'm not even sure I know what that means. But this is what gets me. And there are two things here. First of all, I resent the way that all this technology attempts to control us. Now, I'm sure you've had lots of people saying this before. I'm just a paranoid earthling, as they say, who's afraid that machines are going to take over. But I have seen it with the mathematics, with the arithmetic going out the window. Now, the kind of maths I did at Oxford was very pure. It was not applied. So it was never really used for technology. So I think a pure mathematician has that inbuilt bias against applied mathematicians, because applied mathematicians are so much of this world, whereas pure mathematicians are so much not of this world.
There's your unconscious bias.
Exactly, absolutely. So we float on this other plane. We work out the maths in the fifth and sixth and seventh dimensions. And we were told rather proudly, I remember the very first lecture I attended at Oxford, the guy said, the maths we do will only have practical applications 50 years from now, not now. Just be aware of that. It is not of any use to you in your real world. And I rather like that, because that's where I prefer to be. Now, get back to the applied maths and the applied maths producing technology. What has happened is that the people who make this technology control us. So it began in the good old bad old days with hi-fi. You bought your hi-fi system as a young student in the 70s, 80s, whatever. And you found within 6 months it was out of date. And then 6 months later, that machine was out of date. But the really evil part of this was the person who sold that, in those days it was Sony or Akai or Marantz or whoever, knew that when they put out the new machine in a certain month, they already had the next machine in line waiting to go. They just wanted you to buy this machine and then get rid of it 6 months later and buy the next machine. So it's kind of the same thing with technology. They control you to the extent that they put out a smartphone, but they know the next one is in line waiting to go, but they won't release it. In other words, they won't leapfrog, which would be the kind and charitable thing to do.
So I suppose certainly the lesson, I'm just trying to think aloud, that we should take away from this conversation of, this idea of not going down.
This is a crackpot, don't listen to him.
No, on the contrary, I'm thinking of people I know who would stand in line overnight to buy the latest iPhone.
Absolutely.
You've seen photographs of this. And we have to ask ourselves to put things into perspective. And I think the more important point that you said, which is crucial for all of us, no matter where we are in terms of technology or social media, is the understanding and acceptance that sooner or later, if you allow it, these technological things, whatever they might be, take control of your life more than you controlling them. So it's also about control or lack of.
It's absolutely. And that is what really worries me. But again, it's paranoia at its worst.
Oh, I don't know about that. I think listeners would be listening and thinking, I've got to be thinking about this. I doubt if they're going to shut you down.
Now, especially in a place like Sri Lanka, where there's a very heavy kind of control, shall we put it like that, as politely as I can. So I have about the only kind of Nokia phone which cannot be tracked. But anybody else can be tracked. I mean, the smarter the phone, the more easy it is to track you.
Of course.
I mean, that's one thing. So you take it to its logical conclusion. You'll have a fridge, and soon there'll be fridges that tell you you're out of lettuce or you're out of tomato. Yeah. But it will also tell other people where you are at that particular minute and when you stocked your food and how much you're consuming every day. And suddenly you're consuming twice as much. And does that mean you have a terrorist in the house? Or whatever. I'm just thinking aloud here as a author. But they use this technology to quietly tighten the screws on us, very, very gently, ratchet up the control, so you don't realize. Anyway, that's as far as I need to.
Okay, no. It's a lot that I think we'll all be thinking about. And the beauty about podcasts is we can always play back and listen again if we want.
And listen again, exactly.
Yeah, so anyway, do you have another story perhaps you want to share with us?
Yes, okay, and it's related to that. It's about writing, and I just briefly touched on it earlier. I find that I think creativity for me is hugely important. And again, that's a strange kind of statement coming from a mathematician because mathematics is my first love. But I do think I have this other side of me, the other side of the brain, if you like, which is creative. And I find that the more technology I have, the more background noise I have to contend with, the less creative I am. It's just like the girl in Sainsbury's losing her arithmetic. I feel that the more technology there is, it hampers my creativity. So, to get back to writing, for me, it has to be a pencil and exercise book. At least the first draft, first, second, third draft. After that, it goes off the computer. I give in with very bad grace to technology and it goes on the computer. But never those early drafts. And I guess this is exactly related to the second point, so forgive me, it's not really a third separate point.
No, it's connected, yeah.
It's connected. In terms of writing, I find the more technology you have in your brain, for instance, the internet is hugely useful when you're writing. There are lots of stuff. In my early books, none of them were written with the internet because I didn't even have the use of a computer till relatively late. Everything was purely on memory, and memory, as you know, can be defective. However, it doesn't really matter because it's your creation, and the reader has to take it on board that an author's memory can be defective. It's not exactitude we're after, it's verisimilitude. It's a different thing. So you get back to today, I do have the internet, I do use it for my stories, I check up on things. But at the end of the day, it's purely me. It's my version of a story, it's my version of an event.
You write fiction, you're not writing, you're not researching and writing a factual book on Gandhi or Nehru or something. That's not what you're about.
Absolutely. Yeah. And for that, it would be entirely different. You would be dependent on technology. You would have to be dependent on it because everybody else can see that you've written a bunch of rubbish if you get it all wrong.
Sure.
But for fiction, it's different. It is almost better to have your experience of that defective memory than to have the accuracy, the exactitude of what's on the computer. Because quite often, your reactions to something, I mean, let's face it, we're all human beings. So we go into any situation and our taking away from it, the information we take away can be tainted anyway because we're seeing it through prejudiced eyes. You know, your version and my version of when we met once in our lives, I know, and my memory of it may be entirely different from yours. And yet we're equally right, you know?
Absolutely.
So this is my point.
Or even more importantly, you and I, we didn't know each other then, arrived in London around the same time to Thatcher's London in the early 80s. But you obviously already knew England because you'd gone to school and university there. Whereas I came straight from India, having never left India until then. And therefore, we come with our own stories, our own experiences, our own unconscious biases. Exactly. Yeah. I didn't want to use that word, but whatever stories they might be, good, bad, and ugly stories within us. And so we arrive in South London, which is where I coincidentally also happened to live, but not Brixton. I was not far from South London. I continue to live walking distance from Brixton today. So it's such a coincidence that I was so completely immersed in your novel, visualizing 80s South London specifically. and learning and understanding. But it's not just for Londoners, I should hasten to add.
Yeah.
You can actually never have been to London and you still get a lot out of it because it's so much a book about identity, about learning to appreciate who I am, how I am, being curious, and also kind of challenging the status quo. So there are so many aspects of what I would call unconscious bias that you talk about without using those two words in your book.
Absolutely.
You talk about building, you talk about South London, those kind of the headlines. But, if you go under the headlines, it's a very clever book. I just wanted to kind of add to that. But Ashok, so you've got all these, for want of a better word, fairly firm beliefs on
how tactful you are.
But no, which is fair enough. And that's fine. And actually, you know what? Sometimes I'm going to look up and say, oh, for God's sake, I wish I were Ashok, because we are completely overwhelmed with all the demands that such modern technology makes of us. And that really does. And therefore, I respect somebody like you who chooses to manage and survive and actually survive well without using these wretched things. But other than that, though, there must be other kind of unconscious biases that creep up and kind of suddenly pinch you on the bottom when you're least expecting it. How do you manage that?
I think the real lesson I've learned in this longish kind of life I've lived is that you've got to try and treat every situation as if it's the very first time. I mean, I'm sure lots of people have said this before, it's nothing new, but you've got to look outside your window as if it's the very first time you're looking outside your window. And it's really difficult to do. And I think as a writer, it's almost essential that you do it like that so that you see it freshly each time. It's very difficult to do. So to get back to the unconscious bias, I mean, your biases continue to live with you. It's rather like having TB in your bloodstream. It's there forever. You never really get rid of it. It's there. So you just have to fight it or be conscious that it's there and overcome it, if fighting is the wrong word. And with unconscious bias, I think if you want to fight it, that is, there may be other biases that you're very happy with and you set them as boundaries and you're okay with living with those. But there are lots of others that you really do need to fight every day. Or perhaps that's the only way of coping, is to remind yourself that you are, after all, a human being with your very illogical notions and so on.
No, that's brilliant. Be curious, constantly question yourself. And you use the word fight, which probably is, because It's not easy. And so keep at it. Don't give up.
Don't give up. Absolutely not. Yeah.
I've enjoyed this conversation, Ashok, very much. You stay safe in Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much.
There's lots going on there that the world is worried about, and we hope that it gets to be a safe place soon.
Yes,
also,
absolutely.
Certainly I would urge listeners to go out and get The Unmarriageable Man. I know it's on Amazon. You can get it, I think, in most Amazon websites. So please check, and depending on which country you're in. You can definitely get it in India, because I bought it in India and read it in India. But even other countries, I imagine you can get it in most Amazon. So do find and read it, The Unmarriageable Man by Ashok Ferrey. But other than that, I've really enjoyed talking to Ashok Ferrey, the builder, the personal trainer, and of course, the award-winning writer. Thank you so much for your time, Ashok.
Thank you, Smita. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on your show.
Proud to announce that my podcast series is now heard in 104 countries, ranging from Guadeloupe to Iceland, Argentina to Palestine, and even Morocco. It is ranked in the top 3% worldwide. This is clearly a series that connects with people all over the world, and you are one of them. I thank you for listening. I would also like to thank Jack Godfrey for his original music in the closing of each podcast interview. If you like this episode, please do share, rate, and review. I am Smita Tharoor. Until next time.